I'm Lucas Morell, Professor of Politics at Washington and Lee University, and I welcome you to the second in a series of lectures devoted to Abraham Lincoln. Later this month, Professor John Channing Briggs will lecture on the topic, What Shakespeare Taught Lincoln. I would like to thank the Johnson Program in Leadership and Integrity, the Apgar Foundation, and the Politics Department for their support of this Lincoln Lecture Series. I'm delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Diana Schaub, a professor of political science at Loyola College in Maryland, where she specializes in political philosophy and American political thought. She served on President Bush's Council on Bioethics and currently serves on the Hoover Institution Task Force on the Virtues of a Free Society. On that subject, if you're interested in how baseball contributes to the virtues of a free society, Diana Schaub has written a splendid essay entitled America at the Bat. Google or Bing it, as you will. Highly recommend it. To give you an idea of her varied interests, I will mention just a few of her other writings. The Liberation of Women, Bioethics and the Constitution, Believers and Barbarians, Captain Kirk and the Art of Rule, Heroism Goes to the Dogs, and I'm pretty sure she means that literally, and Since When is TV a Need? Professor Schaub is the author of Erotic Liberalism, Women and Revolution in Montesquieu's Persian Letters. She is a discrete owner of a Phi Beta Kappa key and has earned her Ph.D. from the University of Chicago. She's a contributing editor of The New Atlantis, a journal of technology and society, and she is, in her own words, the proud sidekick of two Portuguese water dogs. You're thinking, Portuguese water dogs? Yes, she owned them long before Bo was chosen by President Barack Obama for his own kids. For several years, Professor Schaub and I co-taught a master's course for high school teachers entitled Race and Equality. This evening, we will hear about Frederick Douglass's view of Abraham Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Professor Diana Schaub.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you very much for that great introduction. I had a wonderful time this afternoon. I walked around campus. I visited the Lee Chapel. I bought souvenir statues of both Washington and Lee. This is a very history-drenched place. I rather feel, though, as if I'm scheduled to talk about the wrong two heroes this evening. But it is good to expand the pantheon on occasion, and I hope to be able to show you some of the reasons why Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass are worthy of the honor that you already accord to George Washington and Robert E. Lee. Any man can say things that are true of Abraham Lincoln, but no man can say anything new of Abraham Lincoln. That observation was made by Frederick Douglass in his great Oration in Memory of Lincoln, which was delivered in 1876 upon the occasion of the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument. It's still the case today. Not even by resorting to lies and untruth can one find anything new to say about Abraham Lincoln. The truths and the untruths, and maybe most common, the half-truths, have all been around for a long time. The task, however, is not to be original in one's appreciation of Lincoln, but to be just. Frederick Douglass himself so thoroughly succeeded in being just that his oration achieved originality too. His Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln has the enduring freshness of multifaceted truth. As befitted the occasion, Douglass's speech expressed gratitude toward Lincoln. But more intriguingly, it reflected on the political significance of gratitude. It's a speech both of gratitude and about gratitude. Douglass says that the sentiment of gratitude, which perpetuates the memories of great public men, is one of the noblest that can stir and thrill the human heart. Further, he points out that with the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument, Black Americans now, for the first time in the history of our people, join in this high worship. Douglass wants the world to notice what we, the colored people, are doing in honoring Abraham Lincoln. As he explains, first things are always interesting, and this is one of our first things. Now, the story of how the memorial to Lincoln took the shape that it did, and Douglass's role in ensuring that his people's first national act came off well, is fascinating. Douglass was approached by W.J. Wilson in 1865 to see if he would lend his name to the Educational Monument Association, which proposed to raise money from blacks and whites alike to build a black college in honor of Lincoln's memory. Reminds me, this is, well, maybe sort of like Washington and Lee, so this will be his reflections on this may be interesting, especially interesting to you all. A college, a black college in honor of Lincoln's memory. Douglass writes a letter in response, declining to associate himself with the project and strongly objecting to the association's plans. Always civil, Douglass is at the same time emphatic. He states that he regards this whole monument business in its present shape as an offense against good taste and as calculated to place the colored people in an undesirable and discreditable position before the country. I think his reasoning on this is worth quoting and exploring at length, in part because our own philanthropic instincts and practices have become so much less scrupulous than those articulated by Douglass. So here's what Douglass says. For a monument by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. For a college by itself and upon its own merits, I say good. But for a college monument or for a monument college, I do not say good. The whole scheme is derogatory to the character of the colored people of the United States. It carries on its front a distasteful implication. It looks to me like an attempt to wash the black man's face in the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln. I am for washing the black man's face, that is, educating his mind, for that is a good thing to be done. And I appreciate the nation's tears for Abraham Lincoln. But I am not so enterprising as to think of turning the nation's veneration for our martyred president into a means of advantage to the colored people and of sending around the hat to a mourning public. So Douglass doesn't want gratitude, which he calls one of the holiest sentiments of the human heart, to be contaminated with such blatant self-interest. Gratitude isn't even gratitude then. One can only imagine with what anathemas he would heap our modern-day tax write-off for charitable giving. In thus incentivizing charity, we indicate that we care more for the gifts than for the giver, more for quantity than quality. In the proposed monument scheme, the problem of impure motives was even worse, since there would not just be a mixture of motives, but actually a division of motives along racial lines. Whites would be doing the charitable giving, and blacks the self-interested taking. So instead of an ennobling display of black gratitude, which would elevate the givers, and moreover elevate the givers in the minds of white observers, this college monument idea would reduce blacks primarily to the role of recipients. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Douglass was in principle opposed to white philanthropy on behalf of blacks. Years earlier, he had actually sketched out a plan for an industrial college in answer to an inquiry from Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had written him asking what she could do to contribute to black uplift and advancement. However, Douglass was always very sensitive to the dangers of ill-timed or overly intrusive assistance, which would have the perverse effect of sapping black initiative and thereby impeding the long-term prospects of the race. So Douglass worried that there was always more of benevolence and pity rather than straightforward justice in white America's dealings with the Negro. His preference was for justice, sternly and blindly equal, with no special pleadings or privileges. Now, this leads to what at first might seem a contradiction in Douglass's reaction to the Monument College project. As is well known, Douglass's vision of America, his ultimate hope for America, was a fundamentally integrationist vision. Nonetheless, he wants the monument to be an exclusively black effort. Right? However humble, he says, it should be our own act and deed. On the other hand, when it comes to the idea of a college, Douglass speaks not only against the self-serving hybrid of a monument college, but also against the idea of any college being built for the permanent and exclusive use of blacks. He didn't want to see the founding of any institution that made its peace with the perpetuity, the endlessness of segregation. As he says, the American people must stand each for all and all for each, without respect to color or race. So he's in favor of a separately erected monument, but opposed to an avowedly separate college. Why a freedmen's memorial, but not a freedmen's college? What accounts for the different and seemingly contradictory judgments on these two endeavors? The explanation, I think, hinges on the nature of the two undertakings and their potential contribution to either ameliorating or prolonging racial prejudice. A display of gratitude by black Americans, reflecting the special sentiments that they bear towards Lincoln, would have the effect of undercutting white prejudice by showing blacks capable of the holiest sentiments of the human heart. Conversely, a college explicitly and exclusively reserved to blacks, by accommodating racial prejudice, would in effect bolster racial prejudice. Thus, Douglass accepts all black institutions only with great reluctance and always with the proviso that as soon as circumstances permit, blacks must make their way into the parallel majority institutions, whether those institutions be educational, fraternal, residential, commercial, or political. So Douglass is consistent, I think, in that he judges instances of racial solidarity and group action by the effect that they have on friendship between the races. So his guiding question is always, does the doing of this deed point us toward the overcoming of racial prejudice and contribute to an ethos of common citizenship? Acts of black self-reliance, both individual and group-based, can create the conditions for non-racial or post-racial brotherhood. Douglass understood that before the black man could be recognized as a brother, he must first be recognized as a man, so that manliness precedes fraternity. Now, as Douglass had hoped, the Monument College plan was abandoned, and in the end, the memorial to Lincoln took the pure form that he had recommended. And Douglass himself delivered the dedicatory address at the unveiling of this statue. Not surprisingly, the first paragraph of the address refers to the manly pride with which blacks should view the occasion, while the final paragraph of the speech sets forth the black man's claim to human brotherhood. So that there's a kind of movement in the speech from manliness to brotherhood. And most especially, the closing of the speech pointedly informs those whites who seek to scourge blacks beyond the range of human brotherhood that the Freedmen's Monument stands as a refutation of their blighting slander. In between that opening invocation of manliness and the closing invocation of fraternity, the speech itself demonstrates, with very deep and wonderful sophistication, how a still divided nation could develop a shared perspective on the achievements of Abraham Lincoln. Now, it's very important to remember the date that the speech was given. It was given in 1876, as the Reconstruction period was coming to an end. With the federal government increasingly reluctant to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, Douglass was rightly worried about the resurgent spirit of the Old South. And in the rhetoric of the piece, you can see him sort of working around that and figuring out how to address that. The speech itself has a very careful structure. It's composed of 8 distinct sections, each one of which begins with what the grammarians call a vocative expression, a form of direct address. And, in the first 2 sections, he addresses friends and fellow citizens. And in the subsequent 6 sections, simply fellow citizens. Now, we know that politicians rely on this sort of direct address. Sometimes it even becomes a kind of verbal tic. If you think back to the speeches of John McCain, right, constantly saying, my friends, or think about Lyndon Johnson and his over-reliance on my fellow Americans. Douglass's repetitions, though, I want to argue, are much more deliberate, and he uses this direct address to signal new phases in the argument as he delineates the different but not irreconcilable claims that whites and blacks have to the memory of Lincoln. Now, Douglass begins by addressing his immediate audience, those who assembled that day in Lincoln Park, due east of the Capitol building on the 11th anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. That park, by the way, had actually been designed by Pierre L'Enfant to be the central point from which all locations in the United States would be measured. Now, the audience in attendance that day was a racially mixed one. It was composed of lots of ordinary black citizens, and numerous representatives of official Washington. Douglass in the speech actually mentions the presence of members of the House of Representatives, the Senate, the presence of the Chief Justice and the Supreme Court, and the President himself, President Grant. These attendees deserve to be called not just fellow citizens, but friends. Right? And their attendance there on that day gives evidence of their friendly sympathies. This first section of the speech makes no mention at all of Lincoln, but instead congratulates you, a pronoun that seems to refer, at least initially, only to Douglass's fellow blacks. And so he speaks of our condition as a people, the remarkable progress in that condition. Then he goes on to say the evidence of that progress is a credit to American civilization. And that provides the occasion for a shift from addressing you, my fellow blacks, to congratulating all. Douglass notes that this new dispensation of freedom, the gratifying and glorious change, has come both to our white fellow citizens and ourselves. Now, the second section of the speech acknowledges especially the federal government and the friendly role that it has played in bringing about this new dispensation. The erection of the memorial actually received congressional approval, and in fact, the statue's pedestal was paid for by a congressional appropriation. Now, behind this federal friendship, however, lay awful sacrifice. And this section contains Douglass's first mention of Lincoln, whom he calls the first martyr president of the United States. He refers also to yonder heights of Arlington. Arlington would have been visible from Lincoln Park. There were 16,000 Civil War soldiers who had been buried at Arlington, including 1,500 black troops. So it is, as Douglass says, a blood-bought freedom. A blood-bought freedom, our blood-bought freedom, in which we, the colored people, rejoice. Now, it might be worth mentioning that Douglass was actually not very pleased with the statue's design. The statue shows Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation in one hand, standing over the crouching figure of a slave, with his hands sort of reaching out to this crouching figure. Douglass is known to have expressed the view in private that the slave's posture was too submissive. There was actually an alternative design which was prepared by a female sculptor named Harriet Hosmer that was rejected as too costly, but it would have depicted Lincoln standing atop a central pillar flanked by smaller pillars showing, among other figures, black Union soldiers. I'm sure that Douglass and probably later generations too would have preferred that design. I think that first design really embodied Douglass's favorite aphorism, which he often quoted in his speeches: "Hereditary bondsmen, know ye not, who would be free themselves must strike the blow." Right? Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. Now, having spent the opening two sections of the speech proclaiming the generous deed of the moment and commending it to the notice of men of all parties and opinions, including those who despise us, Douglass, in the third section, begins to speak to a larger nationwide audience, an audience of fellow citizens, not all of whom are necessarily friends. And from here on in the speech, he drops that phrase, friends. Douglass now treads very, very carefully. It seems to me he does not want the black embrace of Lincoln to trigger a white flight from Lincoln. And so he quite dramatically backs away from the great emancipator, insisting that, quote, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. in his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices. He was a white man. He was preeminently the white man's president, entirely devoted to the welfare of white men. He was ready and willing at any time during the last years of his administration to deny, postpone, and sacrifice the rights of humanity and the colored people, to promote the welfare of the white people of his country. The race to which we belong were not the special objects of his consideration. Knowing this, I concede to you, my white fellow citizens, a preeminence in this worship, at once full and supreme. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. Now, Douglass devotes the whole of Section 3 to reassuring nervous whites, whites who are patriotic, but probably prejudiced. Basically, he tells them, look, don't worry. Lincoln always loved you best. Take it from me, a Negro. Lincoln was not a Negro lover. It's a rather startling rhetorical gambit, but it allowed Douglass to exhort white Americans to heap high their hosannas of Lincoln. He tells them, to you it especially belongs to sound his praises, preserve and perpetuate his memory, multiply his statues, hang his pictures on your walls, commend his example. For to you he was a great and glorious friend and benefactor. Now, by the close of this section of the speech, which we might dub the white supremacist section, Lincoln as white supremacist, we might wonder, why are blacks bothering to honor Lincoln at all? Douglass's answer, which is set forth in the last paragraph of this third section, is that while whites are Lincoln's children, blacks are his stepchildren, children by adoption, children by force of circumstances and necessity. Moreover, what Lincoln did for his stepchildren, whether he meant to or not, was deliver them from bondage. So accordingly, Douglass entreats whites to despise not the humble offering of former slaves. Now, Frederick Douglass had a gift for metaphor, and this image of blacks as Lincoln's stepchildren, I think, is one of his finest. It actually accords pretty well with Lincoln's own account of the relation between the cause of union and the cause of emancipation, as expressed in his famous letter to Horace Greeley. Here's how Lincoln himself explained his duty as president. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union, and what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. So, Douglass here is reminding his listeners that Lincoln was a Unionist first and foremost, and that he became the great emancipator only by force of circumstances and necessity. So, whites ought to revere Lincoln as the savior of the nation, and indeed the inscription on the National Lincoln Memorial, which was built half a century after the Freedmen's Memorial, reads, "In this temple, as in the hearts of the people for whom he saved the Union, the memory of Abraham Lincoln is enshrined forever." Now, of course, the Union to which Lincoln was devoted had at its foundation the principle of human equality. So the Union, as Lincoln understood it, was itself a moral project. That was why Lincoln set himself resolutely against the extension of slavery into the territories. If that point were lost, right, the Union would have decisively jettisoned its moral content. In another famous letter, Lincoln indicated that if the nation chose to fatally compromise its own founding creed by allowing slavery to spread throughout the land, then he, quote, should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of loving liberty, to Russia, for instance, where despotism can be taken pure and without the base alloy of hypocrisy. Because the bond of genuine union is a teaching about natural right, American patriotism ought to produce citizens who are, as Douglass says, friendly to the freedom of all men. And in the fourth and central section of the speech, Douglass then presents the stepchildren's view of Lincoln. And the essential feature of that was faith in Lincoln's, what he calls Lincoln's living and earnest sympathy with their fate. Again, Douglass doesn't paper over the disagreements and disappointments that blacks experienced during the war years. We were, he admits, at times stunned, grieved, and greatly bewildered. Douglass provides a litany of the reasons why blacks might have doubted Lincoln's goodwill. Lincoln supported colonization schemes. He refused to enlist black troops. After he finally allowed the recruitment of black troops, he refused to retaliate when the Confederates violated the rules of warfare by massacring black prisoners. And Lincoln revoked some of the early emancipation decrees by Union generals in the field. Nonetheless, and Douglass gives this listing of things. Nonetheless, Douglass asserts, quote, "We were able to take a comprehensive view of Abraham Lincoln, a view that took the measure of the man, and after factoring in the logic of events and even the divinity that shapes our ends," Douglass says, "we came to the conclusion that the hour and the man of our redemption had met in the person of Abraham Lincoln." Douglass then gives a counter litany of the liberationist and racially transformative policies that took place under Lincoln's rule. He lists 9 achievements which culminate in the Emancipation Proclamation. And each time, Douglass repeats a version of the phrase, "Under his rule we saw." Under his rule we saw. I think the phrase is crucial for both whites and blacks. Blacks who longed for liberty, but who might understandably be suspicious of rule and of law, having suffered under generations of misrule. They are reminded by this expression that their liberty came to them through law, right, and through wise and beneficent rule. Conversely, whites are reminded that the actions of Lincoln, which struck not only at slavery, but also at prejudice and proscription, that those were the actions of a dedicated constitutionalist. The closing paragraph of Section 4 celebrates emancipation and, moreover, shows that that celebration can be shared in by everyone. Douglass asks, "Can any colored man or any white man, friendly to the freedom of all men, ever forget the night which followed the first day of January 1863? So whites can appreciate black liberation, and blacks can appreciate white statesmanship. It's a word that Douglass now introduces and uses for the first time in the speech. For the first time, but not the last time in the speech. So on this new biracial basis of union and liberty, Douglass goes on then to a reconsideration of Lincoln in sections 5, 6, and 7. He argues that Lincoln's great and good character was transparent to all those who saw him and heard him. Indeed, direct contact wasn't even necessary. In a passage that has tremendous import for us today, Douglass says, "The image of the man went out with his words, and those who read him knew him." We are indebted to biographers and historians who have scoured and scavenged for all the bits and pieces of eyewitness testimony and hearsay evidence, and who have laboriously contextualized and hypothesized and speculated to such a degree that, with the exception of Jesus, there is now no one who ever walked the earth more written about than Abraham Lincoln. Nonetheless, it's very reassuring to know that Lincoln's words alone are enough. You don't have to read all of those historians and commentators. You can just sit down and read Lincoln. So in light of that insight, a kind of fundamentalist insight, Douglass now revises his earlier white supremacist account of Lincoln. He reconsiders Lincoln's deference to popular prejudice in the appropriate context, that of the requirements of democratic statesmanship. And so here, I'm going to read to you what he says at the close of Section 5. "I have said that President Lincoln was a white man and shared the prejudices common to his countrymen towards the colored race. Looking back to his times and to the condition of the country, this unfriendly feeling on his part may safely be set down as one element of his wonderful success in organizing the loyal American people for the tremendous conflict before them and bringing them safely through that conflict. His great mission was to accomplish two things. First, to save his country from dismemberment and ruin, and second, to free his country from the great crime of slavery. To do one or the other or both, he must have the earnest sympathy and the powerful cooperation of his loyal fellow countrymen. Without this primary and essential condition to success, his efforts must have been vain and utterly fruitless. Had he put the abolition of slavery before the salvation of the Union, he would have inevitably driven from him a powerful class of the American people and rendered resistance to rebellion impossible. Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined. Now, Frederick Douglass himself always occupied the genuine abolition ground. And his editorials from his newspaper from the early years of the war especially often manifested great frustration with Lincoln's caution. Douglass was prominent among those who, from opposite quarters, assailed Lincoln until he was covered and blistered with reproaches. In retrospect, however, Douglass generously acknowledges the partiality of his own abolitionist stance and credits Lincoln as the comprehensive statesman. Fittingly, then, in sections 6 and 7, Douglass transcends race altogether. These are the only sections of the speech that make no direct reference to either whites or blacks. Section 6 describes Lincoln's early years and his preparation through plain speaking and plain dealing for the great crisis of Civil War. Douglass emphasizes Lincoln's humble origins. Quote, a son of toil himself, he was linked in brotherly sympathy with the sons of toil in every loyal part of the Republic. So in this section, I think what really happens is that racial division is overcome, and it's replaced by the division between the patrician, James Buchanan, who was willing to allow national dismemberment, and the plebeian, Abraham Lincoln, who had an oath in heaven to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. So the division that we ought to dwell on, Douglass implies, is that between patriotism and treason, right, which he ties to this split between patrician and plebeian. This theme is continued in Section 7, which considers the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Despite the hell-black spirit of revenge that motivated that crime, Douglass argues that good came from it. Dying as a martyr to union and liberty, and these twin aims are now conjoined and equal, Lincoln has become doubly dear to us. That's his phrase, doubly dear to us. In the final section, which is just one paragraph in length, Douglass comes full circle. He speaks once more to his largely black audience, and he tells them, in doing honor to the memory of our friend and liberator, we have been doing highest honor to ourselves and those who come after us. Note that despite the unfriendly feeling that he ascribed to Lincoln in sections 3 and 5, Lincoln by the end has become our friend. Right? He's able to address him as our friend. So through his interpretation and his masterful presentation of Lincoln's statesmanship, Douglass has knit together the American polity in mutual understanding and appreciation of Lincoln. Douglass has acted as a statesman himself by demonstrating how memory and memorialization done well might shape a post-racial future. Despite his own brilliant oratory, Douglass is aware that there will continue to be whites who reject the black claim to human brotherhood. And this monument, he says, stands as their reproof. And to that I would add this speech too, for it is a generous and magnanimous act. Now, At the end here, I want to think a little bit about what has happened to the reputation of Lincoln among African Americans and sort of bring it up to today. So my question is, what would Frederick Douglass say were he to reappear among us? Last year, 2009, was the bicentennial of Lincoln's birth. It was also the year in which the nation's first black president was inaugurated. I imagine that Douglass, were he to come back, would want to know whether the descendants of Lincoln's stepchildren still honor Lincoln. And clearly some do. We all know of Barack Obama's invocations and emulation of Lincoln, much of it highly symbolic, such as opening his campaign in Springfield, Illinois, taking the oath of office upon the Lincoln Bible, which is now apparently called the Lincoln-Obama Bible. So in this, actually, Obama has gone against the grain of the black establishment, and indeed black opinion generally. For it seems that increasingly the prevailing view among African Americans, especially elite African Americans, gathering force over the last few decades, is that Lincoln was a white supremacist, and he ought not to be the favored recipient of black thanks or tribute. A recent Library of America volume called The Lincoln Anthology, the editor of that volume, cites an opinion poll that found only 35% of black respondents named Lincoln as one of the 3 greatest presidents. Only 35% of African Americans named Lincoln as one of the 3 greatest presidents. That seems to me an astonishing defection, and one that would have appalled Frederick Douglass. I suspect that this turn away from Lincoln began with W.E.B. Du Bois. At least his is the first public disparagement of Lincoln from a prominent post-bellum black leader that I have come across. In May 1922, coinciding with the dedication of the National Lincoln Memorial on the Mall, Du Bois penned a paragraph, a kind of glib paragraph in The Crisis, which was the magazine that he edited for the NAACP. And he begins with an expression of elitist disdain. Quote, Abraham Lincoln was a Southern poor white of illegitimate birth, poorly educated and unusually ugly, awkward, ill-dressed. He liked smutty stories and was a politician down to his toes. Now, some of those statements are simply false. Others I would call deeply false, despite being superficially true. Now, simply false is the allegation of bastardy. Lincoln was born to married parents, although he did once himself suggest that his dead mother was the illegitimate daughter of a Virginian gentleman. This hypothesis was his rather romantic way of accounting for his otherwise inexplicable difference from the passel of undistinguished relatives on both sides of his family tree. It's a young person who from a very early age was aware of his superiority, and he just couldn't think of any other way to account for it than that his mother was descended from a Virginian gentleman. As to being poorly educated, Lincoln, it's true, had the least formal schooling of any American president, probably less than a year of formal schooling. However, a man who on his own initiative steeped himself in Shakespeare, Euclid, and the Bible can hardly be called poorly educated. As to the smutty stories, Charnwood, the great biographer of Lincoln, confirms that Lincoln's humor was often coarse. However, he gives a fuller explanation that arrives at a more complex and insightful truth. He quotes one of Lincoln's associates who said of him, almost any man who will tell a very vulgar story has, in a degree, a vulgar mind. But it was not so with him. When hunting for wit, he had no ability to discriminate between the vulgar and the refined substances from which he extracted it. It was the wit he was after, the pure jewel, and he would pick it up out of the mud or dirt just as readily as from a parlor table. Charnwood seconds that judgment, declaring that his best remembered utterances of this order, when least fit for print, were both wise and incomparably witty. And in any case, they did not prevent grave gentlemen, who marveled at them rather uncomfortably, from receiving the deep impression of what they called his pure-mindedness. As to Lincoln's being unusually ugly, we might find the deeper truth expressed by Walt Whitman. Here's the passage from Whitman. Probably the reader has seen physiognomies, often old farmers, sea captains and such, that behind their homeliness, even ugliness, held superior points, so subtle yet so palpable, making the real life of their faces almost as impossible to depict as a wild perfume, or fruit taste, or a passionate tone of the living voice. And such was Lincoln's face, the peculiar color, the lines of it, the eyes, mouth, expression. Of technical beauty it had nothing, but to the eye of a great artist it furnished a rare study, a feast and fascination. Du Bois, however, stays resolutely, and one might say perversely, on the surface. He points out that Lincoln's gauche exterior led the aristocrats of the day, both the Easterners and the Southerners, to despise him. And at this point, Du Bois, who was himself a member of the black aristocracy, sets aside his own fastidiousness and acknowledges that Lincoln had depths. Quote, in that curious human way, he was big inside. Note that Du Bois says big rather than great. Du Bois is very far from suggesting that Lincoln had great virtues. What he says instead is that, quote, at the crisis, he was big enough to be inconsistent, cruel, merciful, peace-loving, a fighter, despising Negroes and letting them fight and vote, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. Big enough to be inconsistent. Well, let's just take the last of Lincoln's supposed inconsistencies, protecting slavery and freeing slaves. Du Bois's statement of the bare facts does nothing to clarify Lincoln's actual position, which was not inconsistent. As Douglass had carefully explained, Lincoln came into the presidential chair upon one principle alone, namely opposition to the extension of slavery. Because slavery was morally wrong, the institution should not be allowed to insinuate itself into the federal territories out of which new states would eventually be formed. At the same time, Lincoln believed that the federal government had no power under the Constitution to abolish slavery in the already existing states. And indeed, as president, he held himself constitutionally obliged to enforce the fugitive slave law, the odious fugitive slave law, returning captured slaves to their masters. What Lincoln sought to do was reforge the national consensus that slavery was an evil which would be best handled by a policy of national quarantine, quarantining slavery in the states where it already existed. Once the Civil War began, both the legal and the prudential calculus changed. Not because Lincoln flip-flopped, but because the Constitution itself allows for actions during time of war that would be impermissible during time of peace. Now, there's a whole lot more that can be said on that, but I just want to try to say enough about it to show that Du Bois has really caricatured Lincoln here. He gives us a Lincoln who is a combination of the base, his lowly origins, and the baseless, his inconsistent, supposedly inconsistent policies. Now, this debunking approach to Lincoln that Du Bois pioneered reached its apogee in a very influential article in a subsequent book by Lerone Bennett, Jr., who was a longtime editor of Ebony magazine. That article, which was first published in 1968, was entitled, "Was Abe Lincoln a White Supremacist?" To that leading question, Bennett replied with a most tendentious yes. While Du Bois's remarks were still an appreciation of sorts, Bennett finds nothing worthy of praise in Lincoln's career or character. In the final analysis, he says, quote, Lincoln must be seen as the embodiment, not the transcendence, of the American tradition, which is, as we all know, a racist tradition. Adding insult to injury, Bennett attempts to enlist Frederick Douglass on the Lincoln-bashing side, crediting Douglass with having, quote, punctured the myths and looked frankly at the man. Now, not surprisingly, Bennett quotes only from what I sort of called that white supremacist paragraph of the Douglass address, and thereby I think he seriously distorts Douglass's message. Really, it takes one's breath away. Bennett manages to traduce not only Abraham Lincoln and the American tradition, but Frederick Douglass as well. Bennett invokes Douglass only to unsay what Douglass said and undo what Douglass did. This contemporary alienation of affection on the part of African Americans from both the founders and Lincoln is damaging, I believe. Aristotle spoke about the civic good of homonoia, or like-mindedness. Echoing Aristotle, Douglass admonished his people not to adopt for ourselves a political creed apart from the rest of our fellow citizens, both for the sake of historical accuracy and racial accord. The founders and Lincoln need to be restored to their rightful place in a unified national consciousness. And for a model of how to do that, there's no one better than Frederick Douglass. And I'll just leave you with the following passage, which comes from another Douglass address entitled "The Present and Future of the Colored Race in America." Let me tell you something. Do you know that you've been deceived and cheated? You've been told that this government was intended from the beginning for white men, and for white men exclusively, that the men who formed the Union and framed the Constitution designed the permanent exclusion of the colored people from the benefits of those institutions. Davis, Tawney, and Yancey, traitors at the South, have propagated this statement, while their copperhead echoes at the North have repeated the same. There never was a bolder or more wicked perversion of the truth of history. So far from this purpose was the mind and heart of our fathers that they desired and expected the abolition of slavery. They framed the Constitution plainly with a view to the speedy downfall of slavery. They carefully excluded from the Constitution any and every word that could lead to the belief that they meant it for persons of only one complexion. The Constitution, in its language and in its spirit, welcomes the black man to all the rights which it was intended to guarantee to any class of the American people. Thanks.